There's a man lying on a wooden table. His wrappings are soaked through. His armor has been removed, the lacquered plates stacked against the wall, the leather cords still wet with blood and field grime. A lamp throws unsteady light across the room. Bundles of dried herbs hang from the rafters. On a low tray near the table, iron instruments, a ceramic bowl, linen cloth rolled into strips. The man standing over him is not a physician in any modern sense of the word, but he knows what he's doing. This is not a scene from a legend. It is something more ordinary and more difficult. A wounded man being kept alive because he was needed, because he cost something to train and equip, and because the army around him understood, in practical terms, that bodies were a resource. When we think about samurai warfare, we think in terms of the decisive moments, the charge, the duel, the battlefield death. What we think about far less is what happened after. What happened to the man who survived? What happened when the engagement ended, the dust settled, and someone had to deal with what remained? Not the glory, but the wreckage of human bodies that had absorbed blades and arrows and trauma over hours of fighting. That part of samurai military culture is less visible in the literature of legend, but it existed, it was organized, and it tells us something important about how these armies actually functioned. To understand how the samurai army handled its wounded, you have to set aside an image that has dominated popular thinking for generations. The samurai as a warrior who simply chose death over defeat, who embraced injury as a mark of honor and never sought treatment because to need treatment was somehow beneath his standing. That image belongs to later periods of idealization, to the literary culture of the Edo era, when Japan was at peace and samurai writers could afford to romanticize what their ancestors had actually endured in the field. The soldiers who fought at Sekigahara in 1600, or who campaigned through the Sengoku period, or who endured the drawn-out violence of the Nanbokucho Wars in the 14th century, those men brought surgeons, carried medicine, and kept practitioners attached to armies for the explicit purpose of treating the injured. Not because they were soft, because losing experienced fighters to preventable deaths was a practical problem with practical costs. The starting point is understanding what kinds of injuries these men were actually sustaining. Japanese warfare in the medieval and early modern periods was not primarily a sword-fighting culture in the way that later legend would suggest. For much of the classical and medieval era, the bow was the dominant weapon of the elite mounted warrior. Arrows caused a specific and particularly difficult category of wound. The projectile penetrated deeply, often at angles that made removal complicated, and arrowheads frequently separated from the shaft inside the body. An arrow lodged in the shoulder, the thigh, or between plates of armor was not an injury a man could simply walk away from. It required intervention. By the Sengoku period, as armies grew dramatically in size and infantry forces, the Ashigaru, became central to battlefield outcomes, the range of wounds expanded. Yari had become the dominant weapon of massed infantry combat. A yari thrust was different from a sword cut. It was likely to penetrate deeper, to damage internal tissue, to create wounds that bled extensively and were difficult to compress. Blunt trauma from weapons or falls added further complexity. And as firearms entered Japanese warfare following 1543, gunshot wounds, ragged, contaminated, often deep, created an entirely new medical challenge that practitioners were largely unprepared for and had to develop responses to in real time. The injuries were varied, serious, and frequent. Any military force that intended to function across an extended campaign needed a response to them. What that response looked like depended significantly on who was being treated and when. At the higher end of the social and military hierarchy, elite samurai retainers could expect something closer to organized attention. Major daimyo armies, the large feudal forces assembled by warlords like Oda Nobunaga, Takeda Shingen, or Uesugi Kenshin, included individuals whose role was explicitly medical. These were practitioners trained in one of the traditions of Japanese medicine that had evolved over centuries, drawing from Chinese medical knowledge imported through the continent while developing distinctly Japanese interpretations and techniques. By the late medieval period, there were established schools of medicine, ryuha, some of which focused specifically on the treatment of battlefield injuries. These practitioners accompanied armies on campaign. They were not attached to every unit in the modern sense of a military medic embedded with a squad, but they moved with the command apparatus, operated in or near the commander's camp, and received casualties brought back from the field. For higher-ranking warriors whose survival and return to service was worth investing in, this access was reasonably reliable. For lower-ranking infantry, access was far limited and depended heavily on circumstance, who their lord was, how valued they were, what resources were available, and whether they could survive long enough to reach someone capable of treating them. The first and most urgent problem on any battlefield was bleeding. In the field, before any trained practitioner could intervene, samurai warriors and their retainers applied pressure and improvised. The wrapping of wounds with cloth strips, tearing material from clothing or existing bindings to create compression bandages, was a standard immediate response. Among the supplies that a retainer was expected to bring on campaign were basic wound care materials, cloth strips in particular, which could serve multiple purposes and cost little to transport. Getting a man stable enough to move was the difference between a body left on the field and a man who could be brought somewhere with better resources.
Arrow removal was a more involved problem. The techniques for extracting arrows from the body were sufficiently specialized that they formed a recognized category of surgical knowledge in Japanese medicine. The core challenge was twofold. The arrowhead might be of a shape that made backward extraction destructive to surrounding tissue, and the shaft might have separated from the head on impact or during movement, leaving only the metal point buried in muscle or lodged against bone. Practitioners trained for this used instruments, some of which have survived in historical collections and resemble the forceps-like tools visible in period illustrations, to locate, grip, and extract arrowheads with the minimum possible additional damage. Without anesthesia in any meaningful sense, the patient was conscious through the procedure. Some accounts suggest that warriors of high rank were given alcohol or specific herbal preparations known to dull sensation before treatment, but the pharmacological options were limited and the discomfort was unavoidable. Once the projectile was removed, or once a cut wound had been cleaned, the question became how to close and protect the injury. Plant-based preparations were applied before binding, some astringent, some with genuinely antiseptic properties. The herbs drying in the rafters of a field medical space were not decorative, they were working material. Practitioners understood their effects empirically. This preparation stopped bleeding faster than that one. This application seemed to reduce the likelihood of a wound festering. Wound closure used cloth strips, wrapped tightly and methodically. Poorly applied bandaging could impede circulation or fail to hold wound edges together, and wrapping wounds effectively across different parts of the body was a recognized skill. The space in which this treatment happened varied by circumstance. During the active phase of a battle, care was improvised wherever shelter existed, behind an embankment, inside a captured structure, under the cover of trees. As an engagement stabilized or concluded, organized spaces appeared. A commander's camp typically included designated areas for the wounded. In some cases, temples and religious structures in the vicinity were appropriated for medical use. They offered enclosed space, relative quiet, and sometimes existing resources. The image of a wounded man being carried to a Buddhist temple for treatment is not a romantic fiction. It reflects actual practice across multiple periods. For men who could not be moved easily, treatment came to them or it did not come at all. Moving a seriously wounded man over rough terrain was itself dangerous. The improvised litters that servants and lower retainers carried the badly injured on were rough constructions of wooden poles and cloth, and the journey over unpaved roads in rain could be more traumatic than the wound itself. This shaped how armies thought about the location of medical support. Too far from the fighting, and the wounded might not survive the transport. Too close, and the medical personnel were themselves at risk. Experienced commanders understood this trade-off, and surviving records from several Sengoku-era daimyo domains include instructions about the organization of camps and the positioning of support personnel. Rank determined access in ways that are worth being direct about. An elite samurai retainer, one of the direct vassals of a major daimyo known to his lord by name, could expect his survival to be prioritized. His experience, his loyalty, and the social investment his lord had made in him all argued for keeping him alive. An ashigaru foot soldier had no such claim. His wounds would be treated if someone attended to him, if he was near enough to the medical resources, if his condition was not so severe as to make treatment a poor investment of time and material. If not, he would be left where he lay. The documents of the period treat the deaths of common soldiers with far less attention than the deaths of named retainers. The institutional care for the wounded reflected this hierarchy without apology. There was another category of wound care that operated entirely outside the formal medical structure, what a warrior or his immediate companions did for each other. The bonds between a samurai and his close retainers, his pages, his personal attendants, the men who traveled and camped beside him, created informal networks of mutual care that functioned independently of any organized medical resources. A retainer who removed his lord's armor after a fight, cleaned the wound with what was available, wrapped it tightly, and stayed awake through the night watching for signs of fever, was performing a kind of medical service that no institution provided. Recognized practices for emergency wound treatment circulated in the warrior class as practical knowledge, not formal training, but information that moved through military families across generations and accumulated through observation in the field. Infection was the adversary that killed more men than the initial injuries, and practitioners knew it even if they could not name the mechanism. A wound that looked manageable on the day it was sustained could become a source of spreading fatal infection within days. The signs were recognized: heat and swelling, red streaking outward from the site, fever, the onset of delirium. Some preparations had genuine antimicrobial properties that could slow surface infections. Drainage of accumulated fluid was practiced. Irrigating wounds with heated water was part of the approach. But against deep infection, against what we would today recognize as sepsis, the available tools were insufficient. Men died in the days after battles from wounds that had not initially seemed mortal, and everyone involved understood that this was often the likely outcome. This knowledge shaped behavior in ways that can seem counterintuitive. The choice to continue fighting despite injury, something that appears frequently enough in contemporary accounts to be recognizable as a real pattern, was not entirely disconnected from this calculus. A man with a serious wound knew that the days ahead were uncertain regardless of whether he left the field. In some cases, staying in the fight was as rational a decision as retreating from it.
The later Sengoku period introduced two complicating factors simultaneously. Portuguese missionaries established small hospitals in port cities like Nagasaki and Funai, bringing exposure to European surgical methods, particularly in wound management and cauterization. The term Nanban Ryu, loosely Southern Barbarian style, appeared in Japanese medical texts of the late 16th century to describe techniques associated with European practice. The cross-pollination was limited and uneven, but it happened among the people with the most urgent practical interest in keeping wounded men alive. At the same time, gunshot wounds had become a routine feature of campaign medicine. The lead ball carried contamination deep into the wound channel, created irregular paths through tissue, and defied the surgical knowledge built around arrows and blades. What developed in response was entirely empirical. Surgeons learned by doing, observing what worked and what failed, and that accumulated knowledge was eventually codified into the medical literature of the period. There is a detail in the historical accounts of major Sengoku-era battles that tends to get passed over: the formal counting of wounds. After an engagement, a samurai who had participated was expected to report his wounds alongside his accomplishments. The wounds were counted and assessed. They were evidence that his service was real, not a claim to be examined later with suspicion. This practice was connected to the reward systems that daimyo used to compensate their retainers after battle. Wounds were not shameful. Within the martial class, they were a credential. Their location mattered. Wounds on the front of the body were more prestigious than wounds on the back, for the obvious reason. Some accounts describe warriors who ensured their wounds were documented by witnesses before treatment, so the record would be accurate for the post-battle accounting. The injured warrior was not just a body to be fixed, he was a participant in a social system that tracked and valued his service, and his wounds were part of that tracking. Recovery, for the men who survived their initial treatment, was slow and uncomfortable by any standard. A converted temple or a commandeered farmhouse offered shelter, but the surfaces were hard: wooden floors, tatami if available,
thin bedding that provided minimal insulation. A man with serious wounds lay on those surfaces through the night in whatever season the campaign occupied. In winter, in the mountain regions where many major Sengoku engagements took place, cold penetrated wooden structures with little resistance. Wound pain combined with cold and the disorientation of fever produced an experience that bore no resemblance to any sanitized account. The diet available was what the campaign diet allowed: rice where it could be obtained, liquid medicinal preparations that served both nutritive and therapeutic purposes. Wounds took weeks to close and months to fully heal. Whether a man received that time depended on his lord's capacity to sustain a long campaign. In some cases, recovering men were sent back to their home domain to convalesce in more stable conditions. In others, the campaign moved around them and they were left with skeleton care until they could rejoin or until they could not. What all of this describes, the practitioners, the herbs, the extraction tools, the ranked access to care, the counting of wounds, the slow and difficult recovery, is not a romantic system. It is a practical one. It worked within severe limits, reflected the inequalities of the society that produced it, and produced outcomes that were often fatal despite genuine effort. But it was organized, intentional, and adapted to the specific conditions of Japanese warfare across several centuries. The samurai army did not leave its wounded to fate because honor demanded stoicism. It built structures around the injured because warfare required that it do so, and because the class of warrior it most depended on was expensive to replace. The tension between the idealized image of the warrior who transcends physical suffering and the practical reality of an institution working hard to keep its fighters alive is not a contradiction to resolve. It is the gap between myth and practice, a gap that shows up most clearly when you look at what actually happens to the body after the fighting stopped. The man on the wooden table is going to live, or he is not. The practitioner standing over him knows the difference between a wound that can be managed and one that cannot. He applies what he knows, he uses what he has, and the army outside continues to function. They absorb their losses and keep moving, and they rely on men like this one to make sure that as many of those losses as possible turn out to be temporary. If you want to go deeper into how samurai armies managed the realities of campaign life, the actual logistics of feeding, moving, and sustaining a force in the field, that history is just as complicated and just as far from what most people imagine.